In a recent video discussing climate change, the host professed bafflement on the topic and said that he identified with the comment that somebody had left on one of his previous videos. When I hear someone explain climate change, it sounds comprehensible. When I hear someone that explains that climate change is not real, it also sounds comprehensible. I really don't know what to think about this topic anymore. In this video, we're going to look at what a very straightforward critical thinking approach to common arguments can do to help you to cut through the confusion. So let's jump in. There was a recent article that said that the sort of people who go for conspiracy theories generally scored low for critical thinking. Now, it's not my intention to talk about conspiracy theories in this video, but it's fair to say that a lot of the arguments I see being made by climate campaigners of the likes of Extinction Rebellion on the one hand, and climate skeptics often as well on the other, only hold up in the absence of critical thinking. So it's worth having a simple framework to help sort out the credible arguments worthy of consideration, because those exist on both sides, and the ones that are simply mirages. When I see a statement on the YouTube comments or on Twitter or on any of the live topics of a moment, I go through a simple 4-part process to evaluate it. None of them involve taking account of the credentials or otherwise of the person making the argument. Why not? Because highly credentialed people sometimes make bad arguments, and also people often claim credentials that their comments and their arguments quickly betray that they don't really have. Good arguments should stand and fall on their own merits, regardless of who made them. So, hence my 4 stages. 1. What is the underlying premise of the statement or question, and is it sound? 2. Does the proposition include supporting evidence? If not, should it? 3. Does the evidence seem robust? Does it actually support the proposition? And 4. Is the evidence reflective of the current state of knowledge, or is there other material out there? Anyone can use that formula. So let's take a number of statements from people involved in the debates of a moment from Twitter and from comments to this channel. Starting with a big claim to justify action.
You claim to be the Son of God.
Here's a proposition by someone defending the current climate protesters who have been blockading roads. The arguments put in favour of these actions go into variations of the same thing, which is that the problem of climate change is so bad, anything these protesters do is more than justified. So take this one. The important context is that 5 million people are currently dying each year as a result of climate change. That's almost 14,000 per day. With every day we delay an effective response to the crisis, that number increases. What's the premise of that question? Well, there's more than one. The first premise is that action in blocking roads is justified because of a number of people dying each year from climate change. The implication being that action of this sort may have an impact in reducing that number in the future. The second premise is that 5 million people are dying each year because of climate change, and that number is sufficient to justify crisis action. The third implied premise is that this stat is the most relevant one to highlight the urgency for action. Alright, well, the first is an argument that stands or falls on a logical premise. We'll come back to that one in a moment. The second makes a statement of fact. It stands or falls on the veracity of its claim. Would it be a reasonable premise if it was true that if 5 million people were dying each year because of climate change, that would justify a high priority response? Well, you'd have to say yes, wouldn't you? At the time of shooting this video, 4.9 million people are recorded as having died from COVID-19, and that has been seen as a worldwide health crisis. So, okay, a reasonable premise. Does it have any evidence? Somebody asked the author for a source for his claim, and he responded with a link to this article, which is talking about a recent study. So yes, we have some evidence. Third question, does the evidence provided actually support the statement? Well, in this case, it appears very quickly that possibly it doesn't, because the claim in the Bloomberg headline isn't supported by the body of the article that it accompanies. It's quoting a study, and it says this: the extraordinarily hot and cold temperatures that are becoming more common as climate change accelerates are responsible for 5 million deaths globally every year. Note the 5 million figure is not claimed to be newly caused by human-made climate change. That's the figure associated with all extreme heat and cold deaths per year. Indeed, the article notes that the research says that cold-related deaths fell by 0.5% from 2000 to 2019, while heat-related deaths rose by 0.2%. One of the authors is quoted as saying that, in the long term, climate change is expected to increase the mortality burden. Well, if 5 million people were dying today because of climate change, you'd expect him to mention it. But it's happening now on a massive scale. Not that it's expected to happen, not even in the short term, but in the long term. Now, in a purely sense-making mission, you could stop there. The claim is not supported by the evidence provided, dismissed. But, we could be thorough and continue the process to the end. So, 4. Is the evidence complete? Is there other evidence out there? Now, one might take quite a bit of time over this, but in this case I've literally just searched on Google on the phrase studies on deaths from climate change. People who just want to know what to believe rather than academics doing rigorous research would almost certainly just do that. First up, we see that there's a World Health Organization site on climate change in health, and it says that between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year. That begins some way in the future, and it's a long way away from 5 million. Clearly, the evidence doesn't support the claim. The third premise, that this is the most relevant claim on which to base a call to urgency, is also important because disproving this claim doesn't rule out the proposition that the issue should be treated with urgency. It's just that in this case, this guy pushed a fake statistic, probably in an attempt to maximise the urgency for effect. So that brings us back to the initial premise, that if it were shown to be an urgent problem, that would justify blocking the roads. This is a premise that's common to a number of similar arguments, such as this one. People get irritated by disruption of traffic by climate demonstrations. How does this compare to the floods, wildfires, storms, etc. that are destroying lives, getting worse each year? We need action! This is one of those lesser of two evil arguments. Yes, this disruption will harm people, but this is justified because in so doing, we aim to prevent a much greater harm to a wider body of people. But is the claim that this sort of action will help to prevent harm a realistic one? The problem is always that the most dedicated campaigners often massively overestimate how much impact their actions are going to have on an outcome. For instance, there are campaigners who will swear that the original Extinction Rebellion demonstrations are why Britain signed up to net zero carbon commitments in the first place. And yet anyone familiar with the Committee on Climate Change process and Theresa May's government would know that that was all well in train long before they even appeared. But the point is that if the UK moved as fast as it's possible to move on this question, the campaigners still can't claim that blocking roads will prevent future floods or people dying from extreme climate events. Because the UK is only part of the whole, and if it disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow, emissions globally would not be that much more affected. Now, it's not an argument saying that the UK shouldn't take action on climate change, of course. If everybody said the same, nothing would ever happen. But the logical premise of the campaigners doesn't hold. You are doing harm to people in the current day because it gets you media attention, which is what you want. You can't posit the likelihood of future floods and suggest that justifies your action because the process of you getting that attention does not prevent or affect future events. The fact that campaigners can fool themselves on that point, that's exactly why you end up with a legitimacy question. Basically, what gives you the right to take that responsibility onto yourself? What gives you the right to cause harm to others when it's so highly likely your justifications for doing so are wrong? That's a moral question outside the terms of simply evaluating this argument. A subject for another video maybe. Alright, let's move on to a comment on the other side of that argument, which comes in the form of the loaded question.
Anyway, it's a loaded question.
I won't take any of these climate alarmists seriously until they can answer this basic question. What's the ideal climate temperature? What's the point of trying to control the climate if you can't say what you're aiming for? What's the underlying premise? That the question of an ideal temperature is the central one to the issue of whether or not human-caused climate change is a problem. The same premise sometimes gets expressed in the argument that the temperature was higher in the age of the dinosaurs and life thrived, therefore we don't need to worry. The second premise is that action on climate change is about seeking to achieve a specific target temperature, controlling the climate. As you'll get if you watch my video on the Earth's climate history, the premise of this question is simply false. It's not about a specific temperature. Over geological timeframes, life has evolved to survive and thrive in a number of climate conditions, and good for them. But what created problems in history was relatively rapid change, faster than life could adapt evolutionarily. The human race has lived within a very narrow range of climate temperatures throughout its history. We need it not to change too much all at once. The climate can change naturally, of course, and at some point we may have to deal with that, but right now the argument is that we need to stop destabilising it with our own actions. So the premise is wrong. You'd have to support the question with evidence that its underlying premise was correct. Doesn't do that, and I've done enough poking around in IPCC reports and various of the research papers to be able to say I've never seen a proposition that we should be aiming for an ideal temperature. So there's no further to go on that. Now you might say, well, that's all very well for you, Mallen, but what about that commenter you mentioned at the start, who hasn't had all of that prior experience? Fair point. So you would have to do the same fact checking on the premise that I described before. A simple Google search on what is the purpose of climate policy is a good starting point, and it comes up with this, that the objective of climate policy is to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So again, preventing human interference in climate, not directing the climate to a specific outcome. Now, since that was quite short compared to the first one, let's do another very common climate skeptic comment type. The personal testimony.
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
I have lived on this same beach location now for 33 years, but I have never seen the sea level change. What's the underlying premise of the statement? It seems to me to be twofold. One, my living in a place for a long time makes my personal perceptions and impressions a reliable piece of evidence for local sea level rise in my location. And two, sea level rise in my location can be taken as an indicator for whether sea rise is happening globally. I suppose one might add an implied premise as well, that if it's not happening globally, then that's a strong counterfactual to the whole business of climate change. First off, is it the case that living in a place can make someone a reliable narrator for what's happened in that place over a very long time? Usually not, even supposing it's true. I mean, I say that because I get a lot of more or less identical statements by dozens of people, and that's an awful lot, testifying to their personal experience where they all happen to live by the coast in the same spot for their entire lives. Kind of makes you think some of them may be simply making it up. I know, so cynical. But let's say even if some of them are making it up, it's because they saw a similar comment from someone else who was genuinely testifying to his or her experience. So let's take that seriously, face value. But we know that human memory is an unreliable route for finely tuned measurement. Unless they've been in the habit of recording data to a fine level, such as marking high tide marks or whatever, then human memory is very variable depending on how much focus we were giving to something. The other underlying premise, that what happens in one location is indicative of what's happening more widely, we know that not to be true. I covered that in my video on sea level rise, but in addition to global sea level rise, some places are rising because they're still geologically rebounding from the time when they had a massive ice sheet pushing them down. Some are growing because of other geological processes, and some are sinking more rapidly because, again, of other landmass movements. And again, a simple Google search on something like, does sea level rise at the same rate everywhere, gets you straight to an answer that provides the same headline information. Now, since we don't know anything about the area where this person actually says that they live, and the fact they don't mention where they live is also something of a tell, you don't have any basis of support for the premise being put forward. Is any evidence offered? Well, no, it's presented as personal testimony. Anyone can claim to have seen something with their own eyes. It's not evidence in itself. Look, the inventor of the PCR test, Kari Mullis, claimed to have seen a glowing alien raccoon with his own eyes. I'm going to respectfully ask for some supporting evidence on that one as well. Okay, one more. This comes from a tweet that was brought to my attention just yesterday. It's about highlighting the other side's inconsistencies. Which one do you fancy? 2 years ago, scientists say global warming increases wind speeds, good for turbine energy. Now global warming's blamed for global wind stilling, making for less wind production. Yes, I'm confused too. Both of those statements link two different news stories, this one from 2019 and this one from very recently. What's the underlying premise? Well, it's largely implied rather than stated. The obvious premise is that these headlines are inconsistent. The Conservative MP who tweeted it could have been making it purely as an observation about confusing news reporting about global warming. But then he could have been intending it to be a commentary on the inconsistencies of climate science itself. We don't know. So let's start with the obvious proposition. This reflects contradictory messages about what's going on in the world. Well, from the headline alone, you can't fault that as an observation from this evidence. Rising global wind speed to boost green power, said the BBC in 2019. Global stilling is blamed as wind speeds drop across Europe, says the other. At first glance, clearly contradictory. Now, neither headline says anything about blaming global warming, so we have to presume that comes in the body of the articles. And that's our second question. What's the evidence? So the BBC article is based on a new study, which is this one. Having read both the article and the study, I'd actually say on this occasion, and I don't always say this about BBC climate articles, it's a pretty straight write-up. Although it's talking about an increase in wind speeds, that's in the context of it being an interruption to an ongoing decline. Indeed, it's in the first sentence. A new study suggests that global wind speeds have increased substantially since 2010 after decades of decline. They go on to describe that declining trend. From the 1980s, scientists detected a marked decrease in the speed of winds around the world. Termed terrestrial stilling, the decline was large enough that had it continued until the end of the century, global wind speed would have declined by 21%. They explained that the previous theory about why this was happening was that the greening of the earth and or more urbanization was increasing surface roughness, so not climate change. But this new study sees that since 2010, winds have picked up globally. Obviously, the roughness of the Earth has stayed the same, so now they think that ocean and atmospheric circulation patterns have played a bigger role in the change. And obviously, those circulations have been affected by warming surface temperatures. It's interesting that it's presented as good news. It will benefit the wind power industry, which is pretty unusual for climate change stories. However, it also reports the paper's conclusion that this increase is temporary. The authors believe the increase in wind speeds will decline again in future, but will persist for at least the next 10 years. Then we go to the second story, the Daily Mail tabloid newspaper, talking about why the wind has been so muted this summer. This goes heavier into the climate change angle from the start. Industry experts are warning that climate change may have caused wind speeds in Europe to plummet this year, in news that threatens to drive energy prices even higher. Experts are blaming a growing phenomenon known as global stilling, whereby measurable wind speeds across the world's continental surfaces have decreased by as much as 15% since 1980. So these two accounts are actually remarkably in line with each other when it comes to the 3 decades-long trend for reduced wind speeds. The only difference is that one said there's a temporary boost which they thought would last for a decade before reverting back, but since then we've had a very strong example of stilling over Europe this summer. Presumably that question of how soon that reversion happens has been thrown wide open. What does it tell us? This is one aspect where we don't have a strong level of detail in terms of predictive models. But broadly, in spite of the headlines, the stories are pretty consistent with each other. Is it proof of inconsistent headlines making for confusing reading? Partly. I mean, I would say that people shouldn't be making judgments on complex science based on headlines alone. But this then brings us back full circle, because the Extinction Rebellion supporter I covered at the start, of course, did exactly that as well. Is it proof of failures of reporting or of climate science? Not in this instance, based on this specific example. It might be an example of why we shouldn't be buying so many wind turbines, but that's another issue. What do we get from all this? Firstly, you can definitely evaluate the majority of simple claims that are made on the debates of the moment using this simple approach. Identify the underlying premise. Check for supporting evidence. Make some kind of review for additional evidence. These were examples of 3 different, very common comment types. The first one, cherry-picking unreliable headlines to support a position. Over-claiming. This is one that I've seen used by both sides on the climate debate, but it's naturally done a lot more by the climate campaigners. Maybe because they get more suitably alarming headlines to choose from, I couldn't say. The second one, asking loaded questions that, in the grand tradition of "have you stopped beating your wife?" seeks to sucker you into accepting a framing in that sort of invitation to answer a specific question. This I see mostly from the climate skeptics, also increasingly from vaccine skeptics and the like. I also had this one on the Earth's climate history video. You claimed land plants and algae diverged evolutionarily. Can you explain how this would occur and what chemical process would be needed? Where did the information to build the DNA come from? And where did the capability to produce the enzymes that build the DNA come from? And how did a bacteria that has no motor proteins evolve into a cell that has? I'm assuming the questioner is a creationist, or at very least anti-evolution. I have to assume, because it doesn't make a statement. It just makes a loaded question. The punchline is always held back until you try to answer the question, presuming that you have then played along with the framing. Now, I simply decline to engage with this one. I don't deal with evolution and creationism on this channel. It doesn't feed into the current public policy debates that we're having, so it's just not my thing. But let's just apply the process quickly for the sake of this video. What's the underlying premise of the question? The underlying premise is that you need to be able to answer all of these questions before you could definitively state that plants and algae diverged evolutionarily. Is that true? I don't think so. We know this happened because we can track the commonalities in the genetic material. We can estimate roughly when they must have diverged, in the same way that we can look at the bat coronavirus RATG13 and work out that it evolutionarily diverged from SARS-CoV-2 a number of decades ago because of the common DNA plus the number of differences that there are between them. You can observe a phenomenon in action sufficient to describe it and predict it without understanding every single component of it at a chemical or a molecular level. But then that's the point of taking the loaded question approach. It enables you to pretend that if the other person can't answer everything, then they can't claim anything, all the while not exposing you to having to make any kind of proposition of your own. The loaded questions format is a very common one. It's clearly learned behaviour because you get so many people repeating the same killer questions, and I tend to think it's a natural form to go to when you feel there are holes in a mainstream analysis. You may not have a fully formed alternative proposition, but what you can do is pick away and expose what you feel to be inconsistencies in someone else's narrative. It's also very time efficient for you and time disruptive to your target if they take the bait, which is why checking the hidden premise is such a key first step. It saves you a lot of work. And the third form of comment, the comparison, is another very common one. It's different flavours of this proposition. 1 minute they said this, now they're saying that. They are not consistent, therefore we can disregard everything that they say. Now that's flawed on its face because people who follow the evidence will be more likely to change their mind in the face of new information. But even that to one side, the underlying premise failure is often that the authors of two statements are actually completely different people, but they are being artificially grouped together. We see diversity of opinion in our own side, but we expect homogeneous consistency in an outgroup. So in terms of judging arguments on their own merit, in terms of critical thinking, what actually makes a good argument? Well, it's relevant. The argument is relevant to the conclusion. It should be believable. It's focused on the point in contention. It's logically consistent, and it contains claims. All of the arguments I've looked at here fail on one or more of those features. Learning to spot these structural flaws in an argument can be a real skill in learning to make sense of confusing claims in areas where you don't have expertise. By the way, the journalism examples I gave in this video were very mixed. The latter two were broadly right, but that first one was an example of a campaigning headline not reflected by the body of an article. Could well have been an example of climate activism pretending to be journalism, which is a real problem. I did a video looking at some of the more dramatic examples of that in this video here, which you might want to look at next.